There's many people in Russia and in China now who are talking about geopolitics and how the earth and landscapes and geography can affect politics, how the politics of a country and the political system and the economy of a country can reflect the way the land is set up. And generally, those who refer to geopolitics divide the history of the world between land civilizations and sea civilizations. And the idea is that in parts of the world where there's a lot of ocean access, you tend to have more individualist economies, and you tend to have more centralization of wealth, and you have empires that focus on controlling the trade routes. Whereas on land masses, in particular in Eurasia, in Russia, in China, in Iran, and places that are on the Eurasian world island, you tend to have civilizations that are more collectivist in nature and focus on development. And that this relates to the fact that in order to have expansion on the Eurasian mainland, you need to build roads, you have to build infrastructure, whereas in order to dominate the ocean, you just simply need control of trade routes. And so there's a whole lot written about the empires of the sea in the ancient world versus empires of the land, right? And the term used for empires of the sea, they call them thalassocracy. And empires of the land, the term that is used is turgocracy. And the understanding is the ancient Chinese empire was an empire of the land. It was a turgocracy. The Russian Empire was a turgocracy, whereas the British Empire of the 1800s and the Roman Empire, these were empires of the sea, and they were thalassocracies. Ancient Greece was a thalassocracy, right? And that these are two types of civilizations that can exist. And this is kind of a vague historical analysis. Alexander Dugin promotes this kind of thinking. It's very popular in Russia. They talk about Eurasianism or Eurasianist thought. There's also a lot of Chinese academics that are promoting it, and it's been around for quite some time, arguing that the peoples of the East and the land-based civilizations have a different culture than the peoples of the sea. And if you look at the history of the Russian Revolution, many people argue that there was a shift in communism from sea communism to land communism with the rise of Stalin and the defeat of Trotsky. And it kind of started with Lenin. So Karl Marx did most of his writing in Britain. He lived in Britain, which was at that point the capital of the British Empire. And Karl Marx, his writing, he said, "Workers of the world unite." And he was focused on the idea that capitalism was an advance over feudalism, feudalism was an advance over slavery. And the way Marx saw it, capitalism was going to spread all over the entire world, and then that would eventually lead to a socialist revolution all over the whole world, and that would eventually lead to communism in the world. And so Marx defended free trade. Nowadays, Marxists and socialists generally go around opposing free trade because free trade allows banks and corporations to destroy economies, etc. But back in Marx's day, Marx was defending free trade because he said free trade will open up commerce, it'll create one world economy, and it'll lead to a situation where capitalism spreads all over the whole world, and then eventually you'll have a global working class that'll be united and have socialism. And it was Lenin who came along, and Lenin, keep in mind, is not in Britain, he's in Russia. And Lenin says, well, actually, we're for nationalism of oppressed nations, and we're struggling against imperialism. We're not against just plain old capitalism. We're against imperialism, which is the British Empire, right? Banks, trusts, cartels, and syndicates holding back development. And we're supporting the fight of entire nations to break free from imperialism, from this international financial system. So the beginning, you could argue, of Marxism and socialism shifting from a sea-oriented orientation to a land-oriented orientation begins with Lenin. And of course, Lenin forms the party of new type, the Bolshevik Party. And the Bolshevik Party is like a clandestine secret organization, and it's very demanding and disciplined. It's not a debating society like he considered the other groups to be. You're expected to give the whole of your life. People said that the Bolshevik Party was almost like more of a monastic order. They compared it to like the Franciscans or the Jesuits, where you were expected to give the whole of your life to the revolution, right? An organization of professional revolutionaries. And people said that has roots in Russia's history with the Decembrists and the Old Believers, and that in Russia there's a long tradition of these kind of secret societies and organizations that are dedicated to changing society. And that with Lenin, you have the beginning of Marxism kind of leaving the Western sea civilization mentality of Karl Marx and drifting into the land civilization camp. But then you have the rise of Stalin, and Stalin opposes Trotsky. And what is the big disagreement between Stalin and Trotsky? Trotsky says he's for permanent revolution, which is spread communism all over the entire world. And Stalin says, I'm for socialism in one country, meaning that we can organize our economy to have socialism, we can raise our people out of poverty, and sure, we'll support revolutionary movements in other countries, but that's not the focus. The revolution in other countries is not our business necessarily. We just want to focus on raising our own people up out of poverty, organizing our society this way. Stalin says they need to have 5-year economic plans to industrialize the country. Trotsky says that he wants to draft everyone into the military and militarize the economy and use the military to then spread communism into Europe to have global permanent revolution. And we all know that Trotsky lost and Stalin won over Trotsky, so Trotsky fled first to Turkey and then to France and then to Mexico. And he formed his own organization, the Fourth International, he called it, or the Trotskyites. The Trotskyites were against the Soviet Union. They invoked Lenin and communist history, but they said they were against Stalin. They said Stalin he led what they called a parasitical bureaucracy, and so they were opposing Stalin, and they were calling for a political revolution to overthrow the Soviet government. Eventually, as we saw in the film last night, a number of leaders of the Soviet government were arrested for allegedly being in a conspiracy with Trotsky and getting funding and support from the Nazis to try and overthrow Stalin. Trotsky was found guilty in absentia in the Soviet Union for being the leader of this conspiracy. And then in Mexico City, he was killed. Somebody came into his home and ice-picked him in the head, and he was killed. And that was, as World War II was breaking out, he was killed. And so Trotsky and Stalin kind of represented, I would argue, the land versus the sea division in communism. Whereas Stalin was a guy from the countryside. He was Country Joe. He was from a small village in Georgia. He'd gone to seminary school to learn to be a priest. And in priest school, he had been kind of a rebellious student. He dropped out of seminary school and eventually joined the Bolsheviks. He was a union organizer. He was the editor of Pravda, which was the daily agitational newspaper that they distributed. Trotsky, on the other hand, spent most of his life in exile. He was from Ukraine, but he lived most of his life in Paris and Berlin and Vienna. And he was this well-known revolutionary intellectual who was known at the time of the Russian Revolution. He was living in New York City, where he had a newspaper called, if there's any Russian speakers here, I'm going to butcher this, Novy Mir, which means new peace or new world. And he had a newspaper for Russian-speaking folks in New York City. And when the Russian Revolution happened, he went back to Russia, and he joined the Bolsheviks. Lenin and Trotsky had vehemently disagreed with each other. They had very big disagreements. However, he saw the Bolsheviks were going to win, and so he joined the Bolsheviks in July of 1917, and the Bolsheviks took power in October of 1917. And Trotsky had his theory of permanent revolution, which Lenin had always rejected. And the main disagreement was that Lenin called for a revolutionary dictatorship of the workers and the peasants, meaning that they were going to have the working class was a small minority in the country, just the people in the cities, but the bulk of the Russian population were peasants. And so they were going to build a revolutionary government of workers and peasants. Trotsky said peasants are an inherently backward class because they were working farms that are owned by nobles. They aspire to own their own farms. They aspire to become capitalists. They seek to become capitalists. They have a reactionary aspiration, so they're an inherently backward class. So any government, any revolutionary government that came into existence couldn't include the peasantry because they were inherently backward. Well, you couldn't have had a revolution in Russia if it hadn't included the peasantry, because they were the overwhelming majority of the population. But Trotsky had grown up in Ukraine, and he had been a victim of anti-Semitism at the hands of a lot of Russian peasants, and he had the belief that the Russian peasantry was inherently reactionary. And that was the primary disagreement between him and Lenin. Lenin wanted to organize the peasantry and want an alliance with the working class, and Trotsky said the peasants are inherently backward and reactionary. And because Russia had a peasant majority, Trotsky said the only place that it would really count to have a communist revolution was the Western countries. So if Russia had a revolution, it would just be a temporary holdout to spread communism to where it really mattered, the West, where they don't have peasants anymore. Right? That was the idea, because peasants were inherently backward. Another thing that Lenin and Trotsky disagreed about was that Trotsky was going around calling for the creation of the United States of Europe, the European Union. He was going around saying that if we brought all the European countries into one country, that would break down national barriers and the workers would come together and they'd have a revolution. And Lenin said, we don't want that. We don't want all the Western imperialist countries to come together, because then as they combine their strength, they can more effectively colonize and exploit the third world. So we don't want to create a United States of Europe. In fact, we want the Western imperialist countries to be divided, because that can open the door for colonized countries to get their freedom. So that was a big source of disagreement between the two of them. And then Trotsky announced, on the verge of the Russian Revolution breaking out, he announced that, he repented or whatever, he supported Lenin, he joined the Bolsheviks, but then after Lenin's death, he starts talking about the permanent revolution again, and of course he has a falling out and a disagreement with Stalin, and he forms the Trotskyite movement, which is the other communists, right? It was a way that one could be a communist, but against the Soviet Union, against the socialist countries, in the name of permanent revolution, in the name of being ultra-revolutionary, you would oppose the actual communist governments. And that was the disagreement. And it was really, in essence, a lot about land versus sea, but also about the East versus the West. Trotsky was holding on to Western Marxism, and Lenin and later Stalin had taken Marxism in an Eastern direction, and there was a clear divide. And when we think of the revolutionary movement in Europe, we think of the middle class. We think of, if you ever see Les Miserables, right? Those guys in the pubs, do you hear the people sing, and waving the red flags, and the intellectual students who want freedom and want to rebel and tear the world down. That's the ideology of the Western revolutionary middle class intelligentsia. And that was Trotsky. That's what he was about. But if you look at Stalin, Stalin's a guy from the countryside who went to seminary school. And there's almost a conservatism about Stalin. Stalin is trying to build a movement of people that are patriotic and loyal to their country and want to use socialist methods to build their country up. And there's a disagreement. And this is the Stalin-Trotsky divide. And it's important to understand this divide because it's rather key in understanding where PSL and Sam Marcy came from. So Sam Marcy, his birth name was Sam Balin, and he was born in Ukraine, I believe in like 1912, 1911, something like that. And he was born in a Jewish village. And in Tsarist Russia, Jews were segregated. They lived in different villages. They were segregated. And during the Russian Revolution, the White Army was known to terrorize Jewish villages, and the Red Army protected his village from the White Army. And so his earliest memories of childhood was the Red Army, which he called our army, protecting the village. And he remembered when he was a child how he saw those Red Army soldiers come and protect the village, how happy his family was to be protected. His father was already living in New York City at the time, but he and his brothers were with their mother and they lived in Ukraine. A few years later, he came to New York City, but his earliest memories were of the Red Army protecting his village. And so before we go any further, this is an important time to get into what Marxists call the Jewish question, right? Because there's a lot of talk about this in intellectual circles and such, right? Where does Zionism come from? Why are there so many Jews among the Marxist movement in the West in particular? What's going on there? Well, if we look at it historically, right, Jews as a group were not forced to convert to Christianity in medieval Europe. Almost every other ethnic group was forced to convert to Christianity. Jews were not. Because of the Old Testament, etc., they were not forced to convert to Christianity. And in feudal society, there's very little use for money, right? If you're a peasant, you grow your crops, you give your crops to the landowner, you keep what you can. If you're a craftsman or a blacksmith, you work for a noble, you make metal or whatever, but there's very little use for money. There's no wages. However, as the Silk Road started rising from Asia and as international commerce started to develop, there became more and more of a need in Europe for somebody to handle money, currency. And so because the Catholic Church considered lending money at interest to be a sin, but they needed someone to handle money, and they needed someone to be the group of people to handle money, they designated Jews as the group of people, the religious minority that could handle money. And so Jews became the caste of people in feudal society who were assigned the task of handling money. If your father was a blacksmith, you became a blacksmith. If your father was a peasant, you became a peasant, right? If your father was a king, you became a king. Well, in feudal society, if your father was Jewish, you became somebody who could handle money. And the Jews lived separate from other people. We're talking Germany, Belgium, Britain, France, places like that. Jews lived in separate areas, and they were a designated group of people whose job it was to handle money. And there's a book called On the Jewish Question by Leon Abrams. And Leon Abrams was a Marxist who actually died in the Holocaust, and he wrote an entire study of what is Judaism. And Judaism is a culture that originated among this designated group of people whose job it was to handle money. And everywhere Jews in feudal society stopped having that role, they immediately assimilated and converted to Christianity. And that's an important thing to remember, because a lot of anti-Semites and Nazis talk about the biological Jew, like there's some genetic thing or something. Well, all European white people have Jewish heritage probably, because millions and millions of Jews all over Europe at various times converted to Christianity. And that the only reason Jews as a caste were preserved was for their purpose in feudal society as lenders of money. And everywhere that they no longer held that purpose, they converted. And that's an important thing to remember. And so Marx is of Jewish heritage. And one of Marx's most famous or infamous essays, he wrote when he was quite a young man, he was in his 20s, is called On the Jewish Question. Marx had Jewish heritage, but his father had worked for the German government. And so in order to work for the German government, the state religion was Lutheranism, was Protestantism. And so Karl Marx's whole family had to be converted to be Lutheran. And as Karl Marx is coming up, I mean, Karl Marx's life, he's painfully aware of the fact that he's from this ethnic group that is considered to be outsiders of feudal society, etc. He's painfully aware of this, but at the time in Germany, there's a movement of various people that are trying to defend the rights of Jews, trying to hold on to the Jewish nationality, etc. And Karl Marx writes this scathing essay using language none of us would use nowadays, basically saying he wants nothing to do with this culture that descends from feudalism. And you can read what Marx wrote. I'm not going to say it because if someone quotes me as saying it, they'll think I'm saying bad things. But this is what Karl Marx actually wrote, and you can see it on page. Let me turn to what page it's on. And he wrote a lot about what does it mean to be a Jew. And he basically argues that the Jewish culture, the Jewish ethnicity is based on this role as moneylender. And he argues that capitalism, as capitalism is emerging from feudalism, that this is becoming almost universalized, and that there's nothing to celebrate about this nationality, and that he kind of scoffs at the celebration of the Jewish identity. Now, we know what happened later, which is as Marxism was spreading through Europe, many Jews were becoming Marxists because they saw feudal society as very oppressive, because they were interested in revolutionary movements, they saw the governments that existed in Europe as oppressing them, etc. So a new movement arose called Zionism. And Zionism was started by a guy named Theodor Herzl, who was in Britain. And actually, Christian Zionism predates Jewish Zionism. There were some people in the Church of England that were arguing the Jews needed to go back to Palestine and set up a state, right? And then eventually this guy named Theodor Herzl becomes the spokesperson for it in Britain. And Theodor Herzl says that Marxism is his greatest enemy, because Marxism seeks to strip the Jew of his Jewish identity and just assimilate him with the rest of the working class. And Theodor Herzl, the Zionist, is saying Jews are so different and so separate, they have to have their own country in Palestine. They have to have their own state. And that becomes the basis of a fight. And as the revolutionary movement is growing in Russia, there's a number of Jewish Marxists who say that, look, because we're so different, because we have been oppressed in feudal society, because we have to live separate, we can't join the Bolshevik party. We have to form our own party for Jews. And they call themselves the Bundists. And Vladimir Lenin, who is a quarter Jewish by ethnicity, his mother was Jewish, he wants nothing to do with the Bundists. And he actually writes that the entire concept of Jewish nationalism is contrary to Marxism. He wants nothing to do with Bundism or celebrating the Jewish national identity. And he says the only liberation the Jew can have is if the Jew just becomes a worker like anyone else. So Lenin is denouncing both Zionism and Bundism and saying that the liberation of Jewish people comes in the form of joining the working class movement. Also at the time in Russia, as these revolutionary movements are emerging, there is a movement called the Black Hundreds. And the Black Hundreds party is started by the Tsar. And it's started by the Russian government. And the Black Hundreds says the problem isn't capitalism, the problem is the Jews. And the Black Hundreds are forming this radical political group that is very opposed to the revolutionary movement. They attack Jewish villages, they hang people and lynch people. They're very violent. And a lot of working class people that are very angry at the government, they get recruited into this group called the Black Hundreds. So Vladimir Lenin tells his followers they should go to the Black Hundreds meetings and argue with them and debate them and win them over to Marxism. And they go to those meetings, they go to the Black Hundreds meetings, and they are very successful. And there are a number of people that were in the Black Hundreds movement that were going around murdering and lynching Jews that eventually converted to being communists and joined the Bolsheviks. And that the correct approach is to never miss an opportunity to engage with people. And that even though these people are being motivated by this reactionary ideology that's inspiring them to do very bad things, They're doing it because they're angry about the very same things that could make them become revolutionaries. So it's better to engage with them than to just, condemn. We also know then, as the Russian Revolution breaks out, Winston Churchill is very opposed to communism and Bolshevism, so he writes this article saying that there is a battle for the soul of the Jewish people, and one is Marxism and the other is Zionism, and that the British Empire, in order to defeat Marxism, must give its support to Zionism, and it must start funding and promoting Zionism as the only way to turn Jewish people away from Marxism. And Winston Churchill lays that out. And we also know that, after the Second World War, Israel was created. And Israel has a lot of power in the world. And I would argue that Israel, not only is it, it was set up by the British Empire and it's backed by U.S. imperialism, but it has its own center of power. And that a lot of Marxists will just say Israel is a tool of U.S. imperialism. Well, Israel has its own strength and it has its own allies. And at this point, it's kind of humiliating the Biden administration and making the Biden administration do things it doesn't want to do. So Israel has its own center of power and it has its network of supporters all throughout the Western world. And that Marxism largely rejects any notion of not just Zionism, but any celebration of the Jewish identity, and argues that the liberation of Jewish people from anti-Semitism comes in the form of forming a revolutionary working class movement.
Primarily the question of the peasantry, and obviously it's linked to the world revolutionary struggle and his perspective of it. The fact that in China and as well as in Vietnam, the Trotskyist movements were on the sidelines during the revolutions in both China and Vietnam because they did not see organizing the peasantry as being an effective tool to carry out anti-imperialist struggle as well as the revolutionary struggle. So that's a critical aspect of Trotskyism that one can see without being necessarily a Stalinist.
Yeah, well, one story that comes out of communist history is that there was a leader, a guy named James Cannon, was the leader of the Trotskyist faction in the American Communist Party. And he had organized like a secret Trotskyist faction. And so he was put on trial by the party for being a secret Trotskyist and having this underground faction. And so they had people testify against him. And one of the people who testified against him was the head of the publishing company. And they said to him, so is he, buying lots of books about Trotsky or whatever? And they said, no, but he's bought every book we have on China. And everybody knows that China is a Trotskyite subject. And that was true, because Trotsky's main disagreement when he left Russia was China. Mm-hmm. Because at the time, China was a mostly peasant country, but they had had a revolution led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, like a nationalist revolution, the KMT. And the KMT was a movement that believed in independence, democracy, and the people's livelihood. And the people's livelihood, the third one, was supposed to be some kind of socialism. It wasn't clear, Dr. Sun Yat-sen. And so Stalin instructed the communists to join the KMT nationalist movement and argue that if you really want democracy, you really want independence of the people's livelihood, you should be a communist. And they were like the pro-Soviet wing of the KMT. Trotsky said that the KMT was, because it was not a communist movement, should be opposed, and that the communists should expose the KMT and fight against the KMT because it wasn't communist, right? And what happened was eventually the communists joined the KMT and they grew in a huge...
They trained, yeah.
Yeah, because the Soviet Union was providing military training to China and Chiang Kai-shek. So a lot of people in the military and other places in China became recruited to communism. So then Chiang Kai-shek, after Sun Yat-sen died, Chiang Kai-shek came to power and he was afraid of the Soviet Union. So he started persecuting the communists. And
Shanghai Massacre.
Yeah, so the communists fled to the countryside. And that's where Mao comes from, because Mao was the peasant guy who'd always been saying to organize the peasantry. And it was the peasants who made the Chinese Revolution. And before Trotsky died, he wrote vehemently in opposition to the Chinese Revolution because he said these are peasants and peasants are backward. And he said it might be one thing if the peasants are entering an alliance with the working class, but these are just peasants, and they're inherently backward. And Trotsky was very, very opposed to Mao. And on China, he disagreed with Stalin and with Mao, and he said that they should focus only on the industrial working class of China, which at that point was very, very small. And that theory of permanent revolution, name one Trotskyist revolution anywhere in the world. There's never been one.
That's right.
Yeah, right, yeah. We'll get to that later, but there you go. So, go ahead, Nate.
I hope I'm not stealing your thunder.
Go ahead.
But there's a lot of notable individuals who are allegedly influenced by Trotsky's globalism and Western supremacy. Because you talked about the United States of Europe. Irving Kristol was a Trotskyite in his youth. And was Henry Kissinger a Trotskyite in his youth, or no?
I don't think so.
No.
But Irving Kristol, the godfather of neoconservatism, was a Trotskyite in his youth, and I just think that there's a lot of overlap in terms of like neocons want a permanent revolution to spread liberal democracy and capitalism, and there's just a lot of overlap.
Yeah, well, that'll definitely come up in the next section.
All right. I hope I didn't steal your
No,
thoughts.
you're okay. It's fine. I'm just not going to say more yet. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to like expand on the permanent revolution idea. So the permanent revolution concept was something that Trotsky misunderstood from Marx's writings, and it was something that Lenin refuted. So what Marx was actually writing about when he wrote about permanent revolution is the idea that even after a socialist state is established, the revolution doesn't end. It continues. It's a permanent revolution. It continues until communism is established. That's all I wanted to clarify.
If they thought Trotsky was serious, it sounds like the ruling class would be more opposed to permanent revolution than they would socialism in one country. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, you would think so.
Like he's just standing over there doing his thing. He literally straight up saying he's going to leave us alone. This guy wants to take all of us over. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's interesting. It's telling.
Nope.
You want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to say first that Helga Zepp LaRouche is a traitor to the real movement. She is a C-based LaRouche. She is a Trotskyist. The old LaRouche is incarnate in Helga, the Trotskyist LaRouche. It's all bad. That's why she hates the MAGA movement. She hates America First. That's why they had their split. It's true. It's true, and she's never for socialism. She's betrayed socialism in one country and abandoned it for worldwide domination. It's just horrible. But, you know, I think that the land versus sea thing is very much also a question of trade policy just to begin with, even though you kind of characterize the sea as controlling trade routes. I think that's true, but on the same time, both of them very much involve trade, because to be able to have a land-based civilizational national or state infrastructural plan, you have to shut off that sea thing like the Houthis are doing, because that British system of dominating the seas is what brings the free trade, and then they just take the raw resources, but they don't actually let nations build up their own manufacturing base. In the South, they didn't let them have looms because they wanted all that raw cotton not to be developed in America, but to go to Britain and be used very cheaply to make Britain the master of the world and the workshop of the world. So I think the land versus sea thing, you could also kind of see it in what Henry Carey and also the LaRouches have talked about with the American versus the British system. And I think that we need to reform the LaRouches. Helga Zepp LaRouche is bad.
Well, yeah, I'm going to talk about that more in class number 4. But the struggle in American history has largely been a question of, are we going to be a land civilization or a sea civilization? And I think the American Revolution was largely fought. It was in opposition to the British Empire, and it was the founders of this country wanted to be a land civilization. And then you can interpret the Civil War as Lincoln was fighting against slavery, which was an outpost of the British Empire, because he wanted a land civilization. And, you know, I think that there is a push and pull between, will America be a land civilization or a sea civilization?
Right.
So, yeah.
And the difference between Trotsky and Stalin is very much so reflected in the early history of America with Hamilton versus the Jeffersonians. And Jefferson just had this idea of America is this special country that's unique because we have this unique idea of freedom that's never been tried before, which is like this ultimate form of Western chauvinism and liberalism that Dugan talks about, versus Hamilton, who was much more grounded in an actual national project that related to economic improvement, not this idea of, we have the most best classical Western values, but this idea of, no, we actually can develop the country in a real strong way. So he almost kind of, I don't know, I see a reflection between Trotsky and Stalin and Hamilton and Jefferson in that way.
Great. Well, one thing I want to say is that, you know, if you look at what China is putting out now, and you talk to people that are like supporters of the Chinese Communist Party now, they will often praise the Qing dynasty, which is the first dynasty that created one China, right? And they'll praise it because the way the way China was oppressed is they divided it. And you had Tibet separate, you had the island of Taiwan separate, you had Hong Kong separate, and that the Communist Party prides itself on the fact that it created one China. And they claim the heritage of, they admire the leaders in China's history who also did that. Also, during the Second World War, Stalin made a movie, which is actually, it's pretty good, but it's not, I mean, it doesn't seem very communist. And it's called Ivan the Terrible. It was directed by Sergei Eisenstein, who was one of the main Soviet filmmakers. And you watch Ivan the Terrible, and Ivan the Terrible is all about how there was this Russian Tsar who united all the peoples and all the regions of Russia, and he was very strong and ruthless, but he had to do it. And the film is also very important because, you know, as we know, Stalin brought back the Russian Orthodox Church during the Second World War. And the idea that Stalin was a great czar who unified all those regions was a big thing. And if you watch Ivan the Terrible, it's a very religious movie, right? There's a whole lot of priests and Orthodox prayers in it and all of that, because Stalin was very much trying to appeal. He knew he had the communists on his side, but there are a lot of people in Russia who might be, you know, hostile to communism or whatever, but he was appealing to their love of their motherland and their love of their roots and their tradition. And the movie has all kinds of religious iconography, and it's honoring this great czar who unified the homeland and defeated the German invaders. Also, you know, the anthem of the Soviet Union, right? The anthem of the Soviet Union, when it started, was the Internationale, the communist anthem. But during World War II, they changed it to the Soviet national anthem, which, you know, has the chorus about, you know, long live our Soviet motherland, and appeals to kind of people's patriotism, etc. And that you know, you can see this kind of, you know, when you talk about civilization of the land versus civilization of the sea, you can kind of see that as the Soviet Union is around longer, and as Stalin is, you know, especially fighting the Nazis during World War II, very much appealing to Russian civilization that goes back thousands of years, that becomes a lot of what the Soviet Union is all about. So I think that's worth commenting on. And that's especially important now because Putin's not a communist. But Putin's very proud of the Soviet history, and Soviet memorials and Soviet icons are everywhere, and pride in the Soviet Union to defeat the Nazis is everywhere. And in Donbass right now, you can see tanks, Russian tanks, where they have a hammer and sickle flag, and below it they have an icon with the face of Jesus, you know, with a halo around his head on the tank, you know, and as they're going into battle to fight the Ukrainians. So, I mean, it shows how things have changed, and that what's weird is it's kind of similar in China, for example. Confucius, Mao tried to wipe out all memory of Confucius, right? And now Mao is dead. And now in China, the Chinese Communist Party is putting up more and more pictures of Mao than they used to. In the 80s and the 90s, they started downplaying Mao, but now they're bringing Mao back, but they're also putting up statues of Confucius. And in China, Mao and Confucius kind of walk hand in hand as part of China's unique identity that is not Western, right? And in Russia, you can see the Russian Orthodox Church and the great czars and Stalin, etc., and the Soviet Union as part of Russia's unique identity and our history that goes back thousands of years that is not Western. And we're starting to see all of that. And that's when you talk about Eurasianism, etc. And that's why framing things in the classic Cold War way of communism versus capitalism, it doesn't exactly line up, right? Because I can have a feeling those woke people, you know, that are at those protests, well, I might think they're Marxists, but I have a feeling if you put them in a room with those people riding into battle in Ukraine with hammers and sickles and pictures of Jesus, they wouldn't agree on anything. They probably wouldn't agree on anything. You know what I'm saying? And that these things don't exactly make perfect sense. And that if we just talked about this the way people talked about it 50 years ago, we would be out of touch with what's really happening in the world right now. So.
I like that it's bigger than Mao, too, because I doubt he would like seeing pictures of himself next to Confucius.
No, he would hate it. Mao wanted to wipe out Confucius entirely. So now Stalin did bring back a lot of Tsarist imagery. So Stalin, not so much, but Mao especially, he wanted Confucianism completely eradicated. So there you go. What else? Anybody else? Go ahead.
Yeah. Like with the whole like land and sea power thing, I think the biggest turning point in America was the 1900 election with McKinley and Bryan's. Because Bryan's was very much like, we have to go towards localism, we have to go towards strict federalism, and we have to go towards the silver standard. And then McKinley was like, oh no, what we need to do is we need to jump headfirst into this international capitalism type deal, which then led to Teddy Roosevelt, which that also led into a big leap into both joining in on the Spanish-American War to get Cuba and Puerto Rico, and then also later going in and creating Woodrow Wilson, who later decided to wait on Europe destroying itself in World War One, only to swoop in and basically say, "Oh, I'm calling the shots."
Interesting.
Are you going to talk more about the Shanghai massacre later on?
Well, I all I know about it is that after Chiang Kai-shek turned against the communists, and Shanghai, which was a stronghold of the Communist Party, the KMT started slaughtering communists en masse, and so they had to basically take up arms to defend themselves. They declared the Shanghai Commune, and they seized control of Shanghai for like a week, and the Chinese army came in there and killed them all.
Because that was
The question is, does it verify Trotskyism? Because Trotsky is always
Right.
look at the Shanghai massacre as a show. See, I told you. But I think ultimately, when you look at it, that doesn't mean they would have taken power either.
Yeah.
Ultimately, you have to organize a peasantry.
that was just interesting to me
Trotsky's got it wrong.
because as an American, you're raised to Mao killed 50 million people, blah, blah, blah. But then when you learn that it was actually the KMT that drew first blood, that's really interesting to me.
Well, no, I mean, for example, the Great Leap Forward. There was a famine in China in the early 60s, and the Wikipedia page for the Great Leap Forward is like hundreds of pages long, and you can buy all kinds of books all about it because it's all about the Chinese Communist Party mismanaged the economy and it caused all these people to die. But, however, there was a famine in China in 1927 where millions of people died, and the Wikipedia page for it is a paragraph because it doesn't have political implications. And in fact, there were famines all the time. There were famines where hundreds of millions of people died all the time before the communists came in. And the communists are the ones who brought the tractors and actually made China what it is today. But the narrative we get is, well, the communists came in and starved everybody, right? And that it's manipulation. In fact, Edgar Snow, who's one of the most pro-China writers, he was a guy from Missouri, he talks about he went to China and during that 1927 famine, and people were starving, and the main reason they were starving was because they didn't have a strong central government. Because there was food, plenty of food in other regions, and there were other regions where the crops were failing, and there was no central government that could take the food from one place and bring it to another place.
Well, I wonder why they don't spread that around more.
Yeah, and that they had no strong central government that could organize relief. And on top of that, a lot of the fields that should have been growing food were growing opium poppies for the British drug trade. And they weren't producing food in a lot of areas where they should have because the British were using China as a place to grow heroin. So, I mean, there's all kinds of famines caused by, the century of humiliation. The British waged 2 opium wars to force China to accept, the heroin trade and to accept their global free trade system. And as a result of the opium wars, they estimate the deaths in China. The Chinese Communist Party talks about at least 100 million people were killed because of preventing China from being able to develop economically, the drug trade, the enslavement, all the awful things. But there's no body count for that. Right? But the communists come in and they cure all these things. But in the process, there's problems and there's wars and there's mismanagement and there's bad things. And so we're told, well, the communists just came in there and killed all these people. And that's just not a fair interpretation of history.
Didn't the Roosevelts make some money off Chinese opium as well?
Well, HSBC Bank. HSBC Bank is one of the biggest British banks, and it's based in London. But you know what HSBC stands for? It's Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, and it was set up by the British to manage control of China's economy and make money from China. I'll give you an example, right? If you read many books about the Great Leap Forward, they will quote a speech that Mao gave during the Great Leap Forward, and they'll quote the phrase, "Half of China may have to die." And they'll say, wow, Mao was so committed to his crazy communist policies that he said half of China may have to die, he doesn't care, he just wants to implement them. Well, if you actually go and look at the speech, he was saying the opposite. He was saying to the Chinese Communist Party, if we don't change our policies, half of China may have to die. And that's the level of dishonesty there is in scholarship about China. I am sure that there were policies the Chinese Communist Party carried out that contributed to the famine happening. It shouldn't have happened. But you have to remember they had no national agricultural system before that, and they were trying to very rapidly build one. And they were doing it, trying to organize the whole country to rise up from poverty very quickly. And along the way, they had a very major setback. And some of it was just drought and heavy rains and things like that. And some of it was the fact that the country had not been unified. It had a central government before. And part of it was also that the Soviet Union had cut them off. Mao and the Soviet Union had their falling out, and the Soviet Union had promised them all kinds of tractors and agricultural support that they didn't have, and it contributed to a disaster in the early 1960s. But I don't think that disaster proves that, therefore, communism and the Chinese Communist Party has never done anything good. If you look at what China is now and what it used to be, you can clearly see the Chinese Communist Party has had massive contributions,
Yeah.
So.
Now, on this, the disagreement between the U.S. and the CCP with Taiwan.
Yeah.
I mean, wasn't Taiwan originally a part of the one greater China?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, it's still today. The government on Taiwan is called the Republic of China. It's the old government of Chiang Kai-shek. They just are based on the island of Taiwan.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Are you going to talk about the Cultural Revolution later?
That'll be in class number 3. Yeah. Cool. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't think there's anything wrong with seeing Mao as a great revolutionary, but not necessarily a great administrator, and that was why Deng was needed, or other people. Stalin was a better administrator probably than Lenin.
Yeah.
But
Okay. Very good. Anybody else? All right. Shall we move on to class number 2? All right. Or section number 2 of class number 2. All right. So Sam Marcy, he was a member, he came to New York City, and he was a teenager in New York City. And as a teenager in New York City, he lived in a neighborhood called Brighton Beach, and he also lived in another place called Coney Island. And if you go to Coney Island and Brighton Beach, even today, the signs, a lot of them are in Russian, and it's a high concentration of Russian speakers. And he grew up speaking Russian. He was from Ukraine, and he lived there, and the Communist Party was very, very popular in those neighborhoods. And he joined the Young Communist League when he was 16. His first job was at a laundromat, and he tried to recruit his co-workers into a union, and it wasn't successful, but that was his first achievement, I guess. And he was in the Communist Party, and he actually rose up the ranks to be the president of the Brooklyn Young Communist League, which was quite a big deal, because back then the Brooklyn Young Communist League was like thousands of people. This was the Great Depression, when they were a very large organization. And he quit the Communist Party in 1934. And the reason he quit the Communist Party is not clear. Generally, what's said is that he said, why was there no armed revolt when Hitler took power in Germany? Why did the German communists not lead some kind of armed uprising against Hitler? Well, there's a reason for that, which is that the German communists had a very big political organization, and if they had just risen up and revolted, they would have all gotten slaughtered, and that would have been the end of it. And that the fact that they were able to run an underground network that sabotaged the railways and passed on information, etc., was very key in winning the Second World War. And if they had just taken up arms and violently tried to overthrow the German government as soon as Hitler came into power, they would have all just gotten completely wiped out. That wouldn't have been strategic. But that was a thing that was commonly said by Trotskyites. And Sam Marcy joined the Trotskyites in 1934. Now, those who knew him say it was about more than just that. One of the main things that the Communist Party was constantly accused of being was that they were accused of being a bunch of Russian foreign agents. And Sam Marcy had a Russian accent, and he was not born in the United States, and he was not, quote-unquote, American. And you'll notice that during this time, the Communist Party was always putting forward guys who were very, very, quote-unquote, American. William Z. Foster was this Irish Catholic from Philadelphia. Earl Browder was from Kansas, and his nickname was the Man from Kansas. And when he ran for president of the United States in 1936, his campaign theme song was The Man from Kansas. And Gus Hall was their leader for many years, and he was a really big, tall, guy of Finnish descent from Minnesota. And that they were constantly trying to show that we're not Russian agents, we're not foreign agents, but it's just a fact, the Communist Party's membership was overwhelmingly people that were not born in the United States. It was overwhelmingly, and a large percentage of the Communist Party didn't speak the English language. A lot of their magazines and publications were in Russian, Ukrainian, they had a Yiddish magazine, they had all kinds of, and people from all over the world, and they would recruit hundreds of people at Ellis Island. Supposedly they would have people at Ellis Island as people were coming through, and they would just have a sign, we're the Communist Party, and a lot of people who'd fled from whatever country they came from would immediately sign up as, oh, this is the Communist Party here, I'll join, and and it was revolutionaries from other countries who were fleeing the United States would immediately join the Communist Party. And the Communist Party was largely not people from the United States, but they were trying to combat that image.
I love that people from other countries are drawn to that.
Sure.
Or if Americans left and went somewhere else and there was that side, who wouldn't do the same?
No, one story that I was told is that apparently at one point in like the early 1900s, there was an expression, there was a joke or whatever. They would say that when an Irishman gets off the boat, the first thing he says is, does this country have a government? And if the answer is yes, and he says, now where do I sign up to fight against it? So, a lot of people that were revolutionaries were fleeing to the United States. But the Communist Party was trying to combat that. But Sam Marcy didn't agree with that. Sam Marcy very much had this orientation that was, he called that pandering to reaction, right? And, he thought, when William Z. Foster moved the headquarters of the Communist Party to Chicago, he thought that was pandering to reaction, right? And he thought New York City was more multiracial and more cosmopolitan and more internationalist, and he wanted the communist movement to be headquartered from New York City, right? And he very much didn't like that when you talk about land versus sea, Marcy was a sea guy. That was his approach. He lived in New York City, and like Trotsky, he thought New York City was the foundry where the fate of mankind would be forged. Now, Sam Marcy was a Trotskyite, and he joined the Trotskyist movement, but he didn't fit in with them. And the Trotskyist movement in New York City was run by the people that Nate talked about, who eventually all became neocons. The New York City Trotskyists in particular were a group that they called the New York intellectuals. And it was Irving Kristol, it was Gene Kirkpatrick, it was a lot of people who eventually became neoconservatives. And they were the intellectuals. And Irving Kristol, the founder of neoconservatism, I quoted in here if you read, he has an article he wrote for the New York Times, Memoirs of a Former Trotskyist. And he talks about how at New York City College, in the cafeteria, there were two alcoves, Alcove 1 and Alcove 2. And one was for the Communist Party members, and one was for the Trotskyists. And the Trotskyists, most of that alcove were the future neoconservatives. And Sam Marcy was in the Trotskyists, but he never got along with them. And that the New York City Trotskyists were particularly weird. And that other Trotskyists talk about this. Like, for example, in the New York City Trotskyist organization, they talked about how they would go to, one of the classes. There was somebody in the SWP who went to one of their classes. And it was all about, what if you found out that one of your comrades had committed a class crime, had like crossed a picket line or violated a union boycott? Should you tell on them and get them in trouble or not? And they had a class for 2.5 hours discussing this question. Should you tell on your comrade or not? Like that was the kind of thing that was going on in the New York City Trotskyite organization. It was a very, I don't know. I mean, it's a weird topic of discussion. If we talked about that for 2.5 hours, this would be a strange organization. You know what I'm saying? And that was the kind of thing they were discussing. And they were intellectuals. They were largely based on the campuses, and Sam Marcy didn't fit in with them, and they were very anti-Soviet. And then when the Stalin-Hitler Pact was signed, they all denounced Trotsky, because Trotsky said that the Stalin-Hitler Pact, it was done in an opportunist way, but it was necessary. It made sense that Stalin would do that. And they all said that the Stalin-Hitler Pact proved the Soviet Union could never have anything socialist about it. Trotsky said the Soviet Union was a deformed or degenerated workers' state, meaning it was socialist in its foundation, it just had corrupt Stalinist leaders. But these people said the Soviet Union is no good completely, and that the Soviet Union, they called it state capitalism or bureaucrat collectivism. Some of them said it was the same system as Nazi Germany. They called it bureaucrat collectivism. And they wanted nothing to do with the Soviet Union. And they had a fight with Trotsky. And Trotsky, in the final years of his life, his final fight in 1939 was with the New York intellectuals. And they had a very big fight. And Trotsky argued it was like their class composition. He said these people are college professors and intellectuals, and that they became Trotskyites because they wanted to oppose the Soviet Union. And when it stopped being trendy to be a Trotskyite, they caved to the pressure and jumped ship. And that fight, the 1939 fight in the Socialist Workers' Party that led to the New York intellectuals leaving the Socialist Workers' Party, is a big pivotal moment. And the ones who became neocons all left in 1939 or 1940, around that time. Max Shachtman. Max Shachtman was a leader of New York City Trotskyism, and he's a person that I wish more people knew about, because if you want to play 6 degrees of separation, everybody in American politics, I mean, I'm exaggerating, but a lot of people in American politics trace back to him. Democrats, Republicans, the neocons were all trained, they were followers of Max Shachtman, who left the Trotskyites in 1939. George Meany, the head of the AFL-CIO in the 1960s, the top labor boss in America, his personal advisor was Max Shachtman. Right? DSA was started by followers of Max Shachtman, right? And Max Shachtman sits at the center of American politics, whether it's the left or the right or the labor movement or Susan Sontag and Hannah Arendt, they all studied with Max Shachtman. Max Shachtman is a really pivotal figure. And he was a founder of the Communist Party who became a Trotskyist, and eventually he had his own Trotskyist group, and then he abandoned Trotskyism and he became kind of a social democrat. And in the final years of his life, he supported the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Vietnam War because he said it was fighting Stalinism, so it must be good, right? And and that was Max Shachtman, and he's a pretty pivotal figure, and he was the guy running New York City Trotskyism. And so Sam Marcy, who was very, very loyal to the Soviet Union, he did not fit in among the New York City Trotskyists. So he decided that he would go to law school, and he got a law degree, and he became a labor union lawyer, and he made a couple friends. A woman who became his wife, Dorothy Ballin, and there was a Broadway actor, a Shakespearean actor on Broadway named Vince Copeland, and the three of them decided they didn't like most of the Trotskyite groups, and so they moved to Buffalo, New York, up by the Canadian border, and they started their own branch of the Trotskyite organization, and it was under their control. And they started their own wing up in Buffalo, and they were the Buffalo SWP. And after the Second World War, they continued organizing their organization. They had a storefront in Buffalo, and everyone noticed that the Buffalo SWP acted completely different than the rest of the SWP. The Buffalo SWP was going around having protests to support the Civil Rights Congress, and basically the Buffalo SWP did whatever the Communist Party did. They just did it louder and tried to do it more radical. That was basically this. They did whatever the Communist Party was doing, whereas most of the Trotskyites were condemning the Communist Party and trying to expose and oppose the Communist Party for whatever they did.
Did he support Wallace?
What's that?
Did he support Wallace?
They tried, in 1948, Wallace ran for president, right, as we talked about, and Sam Marcy wanted the SWP to endorse Henry Wallace, and because that was, the Communist Party was supporting him, and he was the guy who was against the Cold War, he was supporting civil rights, and most of the Trotskyists said, no, we would never endorse Wallace because he's supported by the Stalinists, and he's not a communist, right, he's a liberal, he's an anti-war liberal or whatever, so we would never vote for Wallace, but he wanted to endorse Wallace. And basically, it was pretty clear that Sam Marcy, his approach and the approach of most of the Trotskyist movement was not the same. There were big fights going on inside of Trotskyism after World War II also, right? So James Cannon was the leader of American Trotskyism, and there was a guy in Greece named Michel Pablo. And Michel Pablo was arguing that since the Cold War had begun and the Soviet Union was at odds with the United States, that the Soviet Union was kind of moving toward Trotskyism because they were funding revolutionary movements around the world. And so the Trotskyists should just join the communist parties around the world and try to nudge them in a permanent revolution direction. And James Cannon is saying, no, the Soviet Union is not moving toward permanent revolution. The Soviet Union is just, this is an opportunistic Stalinist bureaucracy or whatnot. And that was the fight going on. And Sam Marcy sided with Michel Pablo. He argued that because of the Cold War, the Soviet Union was moving in a revolutionary direction until Khrushchev gave his secret speech. And when Khrushchev gave his secret speech, the Pabloites said that was proof that the Soviet Union was becoming more revolutionary because now the leader denounced Stalin. And Sam Marcy heard the secret speech, and he said, this is an anti-communist speech. This is groveling for the United States. So Sam Marcy broke with the Pabloites in 1956 over the Khrushchev secret speech. And then the nail in the coffin was Hungary in 1956. In 1956, there was an armed uprising against the Soviet-aligned government of Hungary. And the Trotskyites all supported it. They saw it was a workers' uprising against a Soviet-aligned government. And Sam Marcy noticed that a lot of the leaders of the Hungarian revolt, one of the main leaders was a guy named Cardinal Mindszenty. And Cardinal Mindszenty had been a Catholic priest who had aligned with the Nazis and had been a Nazi collaborator and was a known anti-communist. And he also pointed out, it's later been proven that a lot of the uprising in Hungary was supported by the CIA and American intelligence. And so Sam Marcy, he wrote an article where he basically blamed the Soviet Union for the situation. He said that they had mismanaged things in Hungary and allowed things to get to the point that the revolt had happened. But ultimately, he argued that the Soviet Union was correct, it was necessary for the Soviet Union to move into Hungary and put down the revolt in 1956. Well, all the Trotskyists in the world thought that, oh my God, no. I mean, the Hungarian revolt is a righteous workers' uprising against Stalinism, etc. And so at that point, they couldn't see eye to eye. And so in 1959, the followers of Sam Marcy broke with the SWP, and they formed their own party. That for like the first year they didn't have a name, but they eventually, their newspaper was called Workers' World, and after about a year they'd been handing out this newspaper, so they just called themselves Workers' World Party because they were handing out the Workers' World newspaper, and they became Workers' World Party. And it was quite a small organization. It was probably like 30 or 40 people when it started, and it was followers of Sam Marcy in Buffalo, New York. And it was also, there was a guy in Youngstown, there was a guy in Seattle, there was scattered people throughout the country, but it was mainly people in Buffalo, New York. They formed the Workers' World Party in 1959 as a split from the Trotskyite SWP. So do we want to take 5 minutes? Or, go ahead, Tyler.
This might be sacrilege to say, but I was walking around the other day and I was thinking, I think I was listening to Michael Hudson. And Michael Hudson comes from the Trotsky background around Minnesota, is that right?
He was the godson of.
I don't know.
Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, you know what? I've heard some things they did there that seem to be.
Well,
I don't know how to argue against it. Didn't they create the Teamsters?
Yeah, the Teamster strike was great. Yeah,
So
they.
it was
one of the
like,
high points.
are they just kind of confused sometimes? Is that what's going on?
Yeah, broken clock is right twice a day. I mean, you know, I mean, the Teamsters. Yeah, the Teamster strike of 1934 was run by the Trotskyists. That's true, and it was good. I mean, it was a good thing that happened. You know, and people can do good things. You know, I mean, I don't think we should deny that. I mean, people for bad reasons or with an incorrect political line can do good things, right? And that's something that, you know, I talk about, you know, in like the first section of chapter 5, I talk about this mistaken search for orthodoxy, right? Communists often trying to find the pure line. You know, if Karl Marx was alive today, he would be a member of my organization because I have the pure line. Well, I don't think Karl Marx would join CPI if he was alive today. I'll be honest, I don't think, but that doesn't matter. I think CPI and the way we view things, the way we do things is correct, but I don't think we're pure inheritors of Marxist tradition. I think we take from Marx what's correct, we learn from it, we take from different people, but this attempt to find a pure lineage where only people that have your political line can do anything good, right? Where you have the one pure doctrine, that's mistaken. And that's not how communist countries around the world think.
Some
Yeah.
Trotskyists got put in prison under the Smith Act, right?
Well, they were trying to disrupt the war effort during World War II, right? That was because Trotsky was opposed to World War II. He thought it was an inter-imperialist rivalry. And so they were trying to unionize the army and disrupt the war effort during World War II, and they were put in prison. So, you know, I would defend their right to protest against the war, even though I would have supported the USA going into World War II, but yeah.